Definitely. Let's dive right in here then and talk, body composition assessment in athletes. Why is body composition testing important for athletes, and really what's the crossover for performance?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think some people get a little bit too carried away with it, and some are a little bit too cavalier. To be honest, from our standpoint, especially when we work with female athletes, and that's been a big chunk of the emphasis of my lab for probably the last 5-6 years, has been on the female athlete side of things because there's so little data in them.
For sure.
Trying to figure out, do the recommendations we're basing on male-derived studies, do they really apply to the female athlete? And we're finding, interesting enough, no, not all the time.
For sure.
But it's funny because I think for me with body composition, the two ways that we tend to rely on it is, obviously, if you have an athlete who's carrying a really high percentage of body fat, my bigger concern more than anything else is an increased risk of injury, simply because you've got extra weight coming down on those joints. Obviously, you're potentially mitigating some of the positive speed benefits if they're carrying the extra weight and things like that. So it's not that we get too carried away with how low does your body fat percentage need to be, but it is one of those things that if we look at areas of adjustment we can make in the off season, for example, that might be one area we key in on. Probably the way that we rely on body composition the most, though, is making sure they're not losing muscle in season and then seeing what we're accomplishing off season in terms of, especially if there's an athlete that we're trying to build up, make more athletic and things like that. So we really use body composition testing to track the athlete as much as anything else, rather than having, these absolute cutoff criteria and whatnot. We do base it relatively in terms of the changes that we've seen them make. And it gives us an idea of how well the programming is working. It gives us some insights into maybe where dietary adjustments need to be made. If an athlete tells us that they are eating enough, which they're prone to do, and we've kind of figured over the years athletes lie.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, exactly. So the more objective data we have to kind of back up some of what we think is going on and help us make the adjustments where they need to be, that's where we tend to rely on it the most.
Terrific. And when we talk about methods of assessing body composition in athletes, apart from autopsy, can you maybe give us the benefits and limitations of maybe the top few strategies in terms of things like DEXA or BodPod, caliper testing?
Yeah, so let's start with DEXA, just because everybody considers it the gold standard, though I think that's somewhat arguable from the standpoint of there's a lot of inherent error with DEXA, especially depending on dietary intake leading up to DEXA, hydration status, and things like that. So it's not infallible. The other problem with DEXA is it is X-rays. And so, for example, in New Jersey, just to give you an insight into, kind of ideal versus real in terms of how you might choose some of these things. In New Jersey, because of state laws and the way that radiologists manage to work themselves in, you actually need a radiologist to read or be present for the DEXA, which means that cost starts to become really prohibitive, as well as who can run it. And that's obviously not true in every state or in every country in terms of the way that's done. And if you're going to do frequent enough assessments, for example, if we want to look at changes every month, for example, 12 exposures to DEXA, there may be human subjects review boards that have problems with that, and there may be better ways of doing it. But DEXA is nice from the standpoint of working with certain athletes and obviously looking at bone density. We're actually in the middle of starting up a study with triathletes, male triathletes. And, one of the things that's been found previously in a few individuals is very low bone density. So that is something in that case then that we would use DEXA for from a research purpose standpoint. We tend to rely fairly heavily on BodPod. So we use air displacement plethysmography more than anything else. It's quick, which is really nice, obviously, for the athletes, and it doesn't require a lot of skill on their end. Just sit there and don't move. Yeah, exactly. It's like just breathe normally, sit still, we're good. So anyway, so we've relied heavily on that, and we can get through whole teams fairly quickly, but at the same time, we've had good reproducibility of results with that. So we felt good about that. One thing that we recently added is bioelectrical impedance using whole body BIA rather than just handheld or scale based. Yep. And some of that more than anything is to start to get at segmental body water analysis and looking at some of the hydration factors rather than using it as an absolute measure of body fat. And it's interesting because we do see some variability between that and the BodPod, depending on the leanness of the individual. But it's sort of another tool in the arsenal. And then I think finally, one of the things that you'll typically see used, and I don't really have a problem with this if you're skilled at doing it, is skin fold calipers. And in many cases, looking at skin folds and just simply their thickness, even if you didn't compute body composition from it, but you're tracking skin fold thicknesses over time, that can be useful information. Obviously, though, I think that one of the ways to make that better is you need to be very particular in what you're doing. And I think that I've seen a number of people rush through calipers thinking they're a little better at it than they are. But I think if you're consistent with what you do and you can track it, it does give you a relative measure of change. And I have no real problem with that. Obviously, my preference, and maybe I am a little biased because of what we've seen with our research, but I'm a little more biased towards BodPod or one of the other sort of gold standards. But I think if you don't have those kinds of resources, in that case, I do think that skin folds can be very useful, especially if you have somebody who's fairly skilled and experienced at doing them, because at least it's a way of tracking your athletes that gives you an objective measure that you can rely on as long as you kind of have the same people doing the testing.
Yeah, it's a great point in terms of having that same practitioner doing the testing and then just being able to use it as a way of seeing which way the wind's blowing in terms of progress or lack of progress. And, on the practical side of things as well, practitioners can have all the evidence base they want, but this idea of even communicating the data to your athletes so they can kind of really understand it. And so in terms of your experience, sometimes when you tell an athlete some information, they sort of do the shoulder shrug as if they, perhaps maybe don't care. And then the other side, you can maybe cause some panic too if you're telling an athlete that they're, too fat or whatnot. How do you tread that line with your communication of some of these results?
I mean, I will say this. I am a big fan of communicating their results to them. I've worked with teams in the past where the coaches didn't want the athletes to know certain things and this and that. Honestly, I have a problem with that because even some athletic departments where policy, don't tell the athlete their body fat percentage and this and that. And I think that in many ways that's very misguided, because I think ultimately what's important is if you're going to discuss these values with them, explain to them what they mean, put them into context, help them understand what is ideal, what's not, how do these things change? Because these athletes could go out to anybody and get tested. They could go to a local gym and have body comp done with a crappy measure. Yep. And all of a sudden now they've got bad information. So I think it is important to communicate these things to them. I've also found that if you do it right and you treat them like they're not stupid, and help provide them the information and educate them, it is a great educational tool for them to understand the little differences that can make a big difference for them long term. And it gives you a chance to be able to discuss dietary intervention. It gives you a chance to be able to discuss proper rest and recovery, the role of resistance training. It's interesting because it doesn't just apply to body composition values. And working with female athletes, that can be a real challenge. Because I think in many ways they don't know what these numbers actually look like. So they hear 21%. They're like, oh, my God, that's awful. And I think sometimes it's giving them visuals of what that can look like for different people, and really, more importantly, what the performance and health implications are. But, it's funny to me, so many of the female athletes we've worked with, and we're even currently dealing with this with women's soccer a little bit, is a number of the players like, I don't want to lift. I'm getting too big. Yeah. Despite the fact that all of our body composition values say otherwise. And then on top of that, as a team, their 40-yard dash time from last August to 3 weeks ago improved on average by 0.3 of a second. But they look at it and they're like, well, that's fine, but I'm getting too big. And so being able to put it in a performance context is I think, important. And certainly our more elite athletes that we work with don't seem to have quite that same hang up as sort of the next tier athlete does. And they just want to be as great as possible. So I think it depends on who you're talking to, but certainly the communication aspect, we're very open with them. And the thing that's important in the communication aspect with the athlete is giving them time to ask questions, and putting them in a scenario, because if you try to do it as a team, sometimes it's really hard because they don't want to look stupid in front of their teammates. So we give a lot of individual opportunity for the athletes to ask us what their results mean or how they can improve or where they stand with things. We've really worked hard this last year to develop an athlete blueprint for all the players so that they can track themselves, because we get them as freshmen through their senior year. Yep. And we want them to see where they've progressed and where they've regressed at different periods of that time, so that they understand how sort of their decisions and their habits are impacting it and how the program is supposed to be working. And it gives them some measurables to hold themselves accountable, but also us, to make sure that what we're doing is working for them as well.